Continuing our series on Hanukah, and I can't tell you how excited I was to see an earthquake. I have never seen an earthquake before, and it wasn't anything, no damage, no indication of it all. There was just some rattling in the dishes of the cabinets, and I was like, I think this is an earthquake. I couldn't feel anything, but it was very, very exciting because the prophecy says he will shake the heavens and the earth in Haggai. So that was felt all the way around. It was felt in Israel, it was felt in Egypt, it was felt in Greece, obviously very close to the coast of Turkey. So very, very exciting. Taking place on the Shabbat, taking place on the 21st day of the 9th month, where Haggai 2 is talking about the 24th day of the 9th month, which is the eve of Hanukah. So we are continuing our series on Hanukah, and we're going to get into Daniel chapter 11. In Daniel chapter 11, we have the most extraordinary prophecy of Daniel. Now, guys, many people will, have established the accuracy of Daniel chapter 11 with historical events. And the purpose of these videos is not so much to go over those. Those are well established. You can look at any Bible concordance and you will see an absolute history. In fact, it's so accurate that it's as accurate as the contemporary historians like Herodotus, even Josephus. The account is so accurate, it's almost equal to those as a prophecy. It was considered so accurate that someone must have written it after Daniel, after the fact, okay? And so, many of Satan's messengers went and came up with this doctrine that the book of Daniel was written after certain historical events took place. We know this is false by the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls have the book of Daniel. Let me say that again. This is so amazing. They have the book of Daniel in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that predates the time when these events began to take place. Okay? So the Dead Sea Scrolls give us the accuracy of almost every book in the book of Daniel, including chapter 11, proving that, yes, in fact, Daniel wrote the prophecy before the events took place. Astonishing. Some of the most astonishing fulfillment of Scripture and historical events that, you've heard through ancient history, like Cleopatra, okay? And some of these ancient stories of kingdoms and fascinating. So I really encourage you to watch some scholars talk about that, talk about the accuracy, talk about the fulfillment of the prophecy. Now, what's astounding is not only does Daniel give us a prophecy that took place prior to Christ. Christ then says, well, at my second coming, when you see certain things, when you see the abomination spoken of Daniel by Daniel the prophet. So, the things in Daniel 11 happened, okay? But Christ says, no, they're going to happen again in the future. So the prophecy has to describe things that would have a fulfillment at certain time periods of the Persian kings and the Greek kings. Okay? But not only that, the prophecy also has to describe something in the last days. So, guys, I've been trying to get this video out, but the information is so overwhelming. I'm just going to narrow it down with a few points here. But as I've been saying, and those of you who've been reading, Maccabees chapter 1, or the book of Maccabees, okay, the first book of Maccabees, the second book of Maccabees, read those guys the first 6 or 7 chapters. Actually, second book of Maccabees, you can read not the beginning, but you could read up until Maccabees 2 Maccabees 9, and you can start probably, I can't remember where it was exactly, probably 4 or 5. So what'll happen is, what you should do is you should read Daniel 11, verses 20 till the end. It ends at verse 45. So Daniel chapter 11, 20 to 45. Okay? Familiarize yourself with all the prophecy. We're going to talk about some of it here. Okay? Then read Maccabees. Okay? Now this is the time of Hanukah. This is a fantastic time for many of you to learn this. These books were not included, so many of the Protestants. It is in the King James. If you get a King James, I believe it includes some these books. They're called apocryphal books. Okay? And we'll have a link in the description field for the first book of Maccabees, so you can read it, all right? So what happens is this account takes place around 168 BC, okay? And it's this time of restoration with the Maccabees. It's a very, very important story. So in Christ, we've already established that when Christ is speaking about certain things, about the abomination in Daniel, he's alluding to details in the Hanukah story. Okay, the time of the Maccabees, the Maccabean revolt, Judas, this whole story, okay? But let's go back, let's take a step back, and keep in mind what we're going to do. In order to try and get this information to you in a way to try to clearly understand it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to approach this Daniel 11 chapter with a couple different vantage points. Because keep in mind, what the prophecy must do is it must describe for us certain things that Dan will prophesy in the future, okay, which happened in vivid detail, okay? But it also must describe things in the book of Revelation, okay? So this whole prophecy really begins in Daniel chapter 10. So we're going to take a unique look at this from the spirit realm, because what we can see is that Daniel chapter 10, even beginning into Daniel chapter 11, in the prophecy, is describing for us heavenly counsels, heavenly orders, things that we see clearly in the book of Revelation. Okay? So I really hope you guys have been following this series of messages where we've been talking about the four angels message, the angel of the covenant. Okay? These are things that are really important for you to familiarize yourself with because they're major details in the book of Revelation. The majority of the book of Revelation is in the Spirit. Okay? So, there are things that are physical, that physically manifest, physically happen, that prophecy says. Okay? Then Daniel chapter 11 gives us many of those details. Okay? We cannot say that all those details were fulfilled and they won't happen in the future because it says this is what will happen at my second coming. Okay? So, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into more of that in the series of the spirit realm. Okay? Because there's certain things where if you try to apply spiritual things to natural things, it won't work. Okay? And vice versa. So, we'll have to do that as we go. But in this one, what I thought we would do is take a look at the Antichrist, Antiochus Epiphanes, okay? He's the perfect fulfillment of the Antichrist, where we can look at the details that are in the story of the Maccabean revolt to understand those details in the book of Daniel and in the book of Revelation that would have fulfillment, okay? There's so many details. I was overwhelmed, and I just couldn't come to grips to how I could do this in a way where, it's just so much information fulfilled. So we're just going to narrow it down to a couple things, okay, in this video. So we're going to see some interesting details about what happened, which will tell us about what is happening already in our day, okay? Now, before we get there, let's talk about how we get here. So we're in Daniel chapter 11, the prophecy begins in Daniel chapter 10, okay? And basically what we have is the angel Gabriel is explaining to Daniel the fulfillment of a prophecy beginning with the Persian Empire. Okay, so in Daniel, we're going to talk about the spirit realm in another video, but basically what it begins with is certain Persian kings. Okay? So we understand those Persian kings very easily because they're in the Bible. Okay, so the historical events begin with the Persian Empire. So the Babylonian Empire ends, okay, that ends at Daniel chapter 5, okay, with the writing on the wall. Then the Persian, and then Cyrus comes in and begins these 4 Persian kings. So it talks about these 4 Persian kings. Some of these kings' names in the Bible are titles, but essentially what we have is we have Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes, and Ahasuerus. Okay, so these kings are very important for us. And again, we'll have to get into this in another video. But if you follow this channel, you'll see that we talk a lot about the book of Esther. Well, the king in the book of Esther is Ahasuerus. I mean, I'll be pronouncing it right, but basically he's a Persian king that we could see in the book of Esther. So he's one of those kings. He's described elsewhere in the scriptures, okay? And then we also have Cyrus, okay? We have Darius, okay? We have Artaxerxes. So these are the 4 very, very critical Persian kings, okay? So let's also talk about this. So in the course of my teachings and everything else, what we're saying is that certain things in the scriptures are telling us about Christ's second coming, okay? Now, in the Jewish mind, okay, even in these days, in the Jewish mind of their Messiah and all that, you have to understand their thinking in these kingdoms, okay? So in their thinking in these kingdoms, you have Nebuchadnezzar, he destroys the temple. Boo, okay? Then you have the Cyrus, he restores the temple. Yay! Then you have the Greeks, and you have Antiochus Epiphanes, the Antichrist. Boo. Okay? Then you have Rome. Okay? Then Rome comes in. Of course, Rome restores the temple. Boo. So really, the only set of kings in the story of the Jewish mindset that would allow them to build a 3rd temple is Cyrus, is these Persian kings. Okay? So that's how we begin Daniel chapter 11 is these Persian kings, these 4 Persian kings, okay? Now, of course, in the last days, there would have to be a 3rd temple. So those 4 kings, their time periods, there's prophecy surrounding them that will tell us about the 3rd temple. Okay, we'll get into that in the future. So what we have is we have this Persian Empire that takes place, okay, over that time period of Cyrus. We'll give you some approximate dates, okay? So the restoration and the Jews returning back to the land, okay, from Babylon, takes place. Then they rebuild the temple in 516 BC, okay? So you have that. Then you have the Persian Empire lasting up until the Greeks, okay? So then you have Alexander the Great, also detailed. Alexander the Great is detailed there in Daniel 11, talking about destroying the Persian Empire. This is also in Daniel chapter 7 with the he-goat from Greece. Okay, so that's Alexander the Great. His kingdom is divided into 4 generals. Okay, so then the 4 generals have certain names, and this passes some time until we get to this time period we're going to talk about in this video of Antiochus Epiphanes. Okay, so he's Antiochus the 4th. So there have been several, Persian kings, several Greek kings leading up to this time period, 168. Okay, so what's happening is we're in another transition between the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire. Okay. So this is a time period of that type of transition when the Greeks are, getting weaker and weaker. All right, so let's keep that in mind, because in the end days, we would have another empire on its decline, United States. And then you would have this Antichrist figure rising up in that transition. Okay, so the approach we're having is that the Daniel chapter 11 has the king of the north, the king of the south. As you go through that, I just want to mention this briefly, that the area was called Syria that Antiochus was in. Okay, so this was, the land of Israel, then going up into Syria, okay, and heading to the east. Then that's the king of the north. Then the king of the south was Ptolemy, and he was in Egypt. Okay, so when you see that, you have different generations of these 2 kings going to war against one another. Okay, and then that leads us to when we get to Antiochus. So what has happened, guys, is this Hellenization of the Greeks, where everybody spoke Greek in the empire, and they allowed the people to keep their laws. And so for the most part, the Jews and the Greeks were not in a great conflict. Okay, so there are many of the Jews that spoke Greek and took on Greek customs and whatnot. Okay, but there were other Jews that did not. And this is important for us because this is the type of divide that happens everywhere, where it's like right wing, left wing. Okay, so all right, we have the empire. When you're in Rome, you must do as the Romans do. Okay, so some of the Jews are doing that. Some of the Jews are saying, no, we're not going to do that. But anyway, it's not an oppressive situation for the most part for the Jews. The temple is there. The sacrifices are continuing. Okay, so that it's not a major problem. They're not tremendously upset with what's taking place, right? Until we get to Antiochus. So we get to Antiochus. Now this guy comes on the scene, and guys, he is the Antichrist vivid. I mean, he literally... his own time period and all this is like 3.5 years, just like it says in the Beast of Revelation, 42 months. And so he comes in and he does things vividly fulfilling Daniel chapter 11, verses 20 through 45 is what I'm going to suggest, guys. I'm going to suggest he's in all of those, okay? Now, as he comes in, there are different speculations about major prophecies like the peace deal, the daily sacrifice, the abomination that makes desolate. Okay, these are major details that we see in Daniel chapter 11 that we also see in other parts of the prophecy where Christ talks about when you see the abomination that makes desolate, and we see prophecies related to the third temple. Okay? So those can be clearly understood through Antiochus. The only difference is, keep in mind, the temple has been there since its rebuilding with Ezra and Nehemiah. So the major difference we have in the end of days is there's no temple, and there must be a temple for certain of these things to take place. So let's take a look at how we can see clearly the notes. Before I get into the notes, let me just talk you through a couple things. So we'll get into the peace deal, how clearly the peace deal, there is a peace deal, okay? Antiochus does it, all right? We get the details of exactly what he does. What I want to do is I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the other prophecies that are just really funny, actually. It's just fascinating. What we see, because in Daniel 11, I'll give you a for example. In Daniel chapter 11, it says that this person is a vile person. Okay, and so when we see this vile person, it's kind of like, okay, those are just two words. It doesn't really tell us much of what's going on. All right, so that's verse 21. So this is early on in our description. Now, I read this in a couple places, but the source I'm going to read to you, and I have in the notes, is Isaac Newton. So Isaac Newton did a lot of research on the book of Daniel, the book of Revelation, and he covers a lot of this kind of transition. So up until this time, it's one of the sources you read, and he talks about this. And so when it's talking about Antiochus, it begins to describe this vile person. Okay, so he reigned over this area that was called Syria. Okay, so now let's remember, Antiochus is Greek, and he's reigning over an area that's called Syria. Now this gives us the title, one of the titles of the Antichrist, which is the Assyrian. Okay, so is the Assyrian ethnically Syrian? No, he's Greek. Okay, so this is where you cannot say what ethnicity the Antichrist is, because he comes out of the Roman Empire. He comes out of the Greek Empire. He's called the Assyrian. He's called the king of Babylon. Okay, so you can't say, oh, he has to be from this particular country. You can't say that. All right, So he's reigning, he begins his power, and he comes in by flatteries. Okay, so he comes in by, he's got a brother that's incarcerated in Rome, and he comes in and says, oh, you know, I'm just here temporarily until my brother comes to take over. Okay? But he carried himself much below his dignity, it says. Stealing privately out of his palace, rambling up and down the city in disguise with one or two of his companions, conversing and drinking with the people of lowest rank, foreigners and strangers, frequenting the meetings of dissolute persons to feast and revel. He clothed himself like the Roman candidates and officers, acting their parts like a mimic. In public festivals, jesting and dancing with servants and light people, exposing himself in all manner of ridiculous gestures. This conduct made him, they made him take him for a madman and mock his name. This is in the first year of his reign. So let's think about what's going on here. When it says in Daniel, it says it's a vile person, right? So this Antichrist is a partier, all right? Not only that, he's an actor. He would put on costumes and go out and act like something he's not, like a Roman officer, okay? And this is the detail of the Antichrist, where it says he's like this, but it only says two words. He's a vile person. He comes in with flatteries, okay? But this is telling us that the Antichrist is an actor. And this should remind you of a certain person doing reality shows and acting a fool, okay, on TV. Fascinating, okay? So this we see in the historical record describing Antiochus, okay? So he's like this. So we have this partier, we have this actor, okay? We have this person playing parts, you know, acting a fool, being a drunkard, okay? So it's a really interesting detail. As you know, I've done this channel over the years. They say, "Oh, Leland, you're wrong about the Antichrist. It doesn't fit the profile." And I'm like, these people don't know anything. So you can't look at Hollywood to see what the profile of the Antichrist is, because they're gonna set you up to believe something he's not. You have to go through the scriptures. You have to look at the historical record of what they describe the Antichrist to be. He's a vile person. Not only that, he's an actor. I thought that was just great. A vile person. And we also get into the peace deal. And another one is, I want to have this whole series in notes for you guys so you can keep them in the notes. So we'll go over the notes. But another one I want to talk about before we get into the notes is that we have another fulfillment of the prophecy related to the beast of Revelation. So when we get to Revelation, we can also find some of these characteristics of the Antichrist in Revelation, okay? So he set up a statue of Zeus on the altar, okay? We know this to be, in the book of Revelation, the image, okay? The image does speak, okay? We also know that there's a prophecy about a head wound, and the head wound is healed. Well, this head wound is something that Antiochus dies of. Okay, so he doesn't die. So when we may look at that, he has a wound. You might think, okay, it comes by a physical sword, and he's struck in the head with a wound. But when we compare the story of Antiochus, the story is a plague. A plague. So in the Greek, when it says a head wound, it's a head plague. Okay? And not only that, we showed you how when Trump got the virus, okay, he was healed with therapeutics. Therapeutics is the Greek word for heal that we read in English. Okay? But Antiochus also seems to get some type of wound and plague that no one can explain. It's in 2 Maccabees 9:5, and the Lord God Almighty of Israel smote him with an incurable and invisible plague. Notice how Donald Trump was talking about this invisible enemy. Okay? That's exactly the wording that you see in 2 Maccabees of this plague. He was smote with incurable, invisible plague. And as soon as he spoke, a pain of the bowels that was remediless came upon him in sore torments of his inner parts. For that he tormented others, bowels in strange torments tormented him likewise. Okay? So what this is saying is that the Antichrist sent forth plagues and torments on the people. And eventually, he himself was tormented and died of this plague. So, we consider the same thing would happen. The Antichrist would plague the people with torments, okay? And then he himself will be struck with this torment. Now, of course, he is, in Revelation 13, he is healed. He is therapeutics, okay? He does not die of this, okay? But it's talking about this head wound. We have interesting insight with Antiochus. So let's take a look at the notes. So in our notes, the profile of the Antichrist with Antiochus, Epiphanes, again, he is Greek. He is the Assyrian, also fulfilled in many prophecies, but we find insight into the covenant or the peace deal. Now, what we have over here is Daniel 11 and just some bullet points of some of the verses. In verse 20, it describes him as a raiser of taxes. So in 2 Maccabees 4:19, he sent this guy Jason. He took 300 drachmas of silver to sacrifice to Hercules. In 1 Maccabees 1:29, after 2 years, the king was a collector of tribute sent into the cities of Judah and Jerusalem. Okay? So the tax collector comes in. Verse 21 says he will come in peaceably and obtain the king to buy flatteries. So this is the peace deal. We know that this word in the Hebrew for peaceably means security. Okay, so when they say peace and safety or security, okay? So what he did is Antiochus came into Jerusalem and he spoke peaceable words to them. But all was deceit. And once he gained credence, or once he got acceptance from the people, he destroyed the city and many people. So the Antichrist made a peace deal with the Jews, okay? That's what we can clearly see is that, yes, there is a covenant. Yes, there is a peace deal that takes place as well with the Antichrist and the end of days with the Jews. Okay? And what happened here is that when the king begins to reign in his empire in this area, they're calling Syria, but it's including the land of Israel. The king made the whole kingdom to be one people, and everyone should leave his laws. So when they use language like one world order or one world government, that's what he does. Everyone has to be, the same. So this is his heart will be against the Holy Covenant. Okay? And so the king then goes about making this covenant with the Jews. And so he covenanted with the Jews that they should leave their customs and their laws. Okay? And many of the Jews did. And in verse 30, it says that they will forsake the covenant. Then in verse 23, it talks about the league of small people. And it says, after that he made a league, and he worked deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with small people. So small people. So this is talking about he makes a league with a small amount of people. So this is the king, and the king makes a league with his princes. Okay? And they were content to make peace, and they made an oath with the Jews. Then, in verse 62 of 1 Maccabees chapter 6, the king entered Mount Zion, and when he saw Mount Zion, he broke his oath. Okay? So Daniel chapter 11, verse 30, it says, he will have indignation against the Holy Covenant. So he makes an agreement with the Jews, and he breaks it. Okay? So clearly there is a covenant. There is a peace deal. Okay? And we can see the details of that fulfilled perfectly in the story of Maccabees. Okay? And as we mentioned, verse 21 describes him as this vile person. Okay? He comes in by flatteries and nice words. Okay? And again, he was sneaking out of the palace disguised as a low person, drinking, feasting, reveling, and acting the part of Roman officers like a mimic in all manner of ridiculous conduct. Oh my goodness. Now, very important prophecies also transpire, which we know to be the daily sacrifice, the abomination that makes desolate, and dividing the land for gain. So let's take a look at those. So essentially what happens is in the year 143, now this is not BC. The book of Maccabees records a certain year, okay, as 143. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what that is, all right? But essentially, he comes in then, and that's 1 Maccabees chapter 1. So when he comes in, he stops the daily sacrifice. Okay, so he forbids them the burnt offerings and sacrifice in the temple. He profanes the Sabbaths and feast days. Okay, so when we read Daniel 11 verse 31, it says he will have indignation against the holy covenant, and he shall return, and he shall forsake the holy covenant, and with the arms he will stand on his part. He will pollute the sanctuary fortress, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and he will place the abomination that makes desolate. Okay, major prophecies. So what happens is when he comes in, he stops the daily sacrifice, and in doing so, he profanes the Sabbaths and feast days. Now, this is important for us. We'll get into another video. We have a video on taking away the daily sacrifice. So what's happened is the various temple institute and organizations have been doing sacrifice for a number of years. But when the events of this year and events of last year, those sacrifices have stopped. Okay, so it says they forbid the burnt offerings and they profane the feast days. So what they were doing is they were doing them on feast days, but they've stopped. Okay, so they stopped in the spring of 2019. After the spring of 2019, there was a Passover 2019. After that, they stopped. Okay, so then what it says is that 2 years later, 1 Maccabees 154, they set the abomination that makes desolate on the altar. They sacrificed a swine on an idol altar of Zeus, which was upon the altar of God. So the distance of time between the daily sacrifice and then placing the abomination that makes desolate was 2 years. Very, very important. We'll get into this in a future video, guys. I'm just planting it as a seed that the story of Hanukah tells us, and that's what it is. Hanukah means to rededicate, okay? So the daily sacrifice was stopped, the abomination of desolation takes place, and then they cleanse the temple, okay? And so you see that abomination of desolation in Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 11, okay? So this is fulfilled perfectly with a space of 2 years when this takes place. Now we get to 1 Maccabees 3:16. He placed strangers in all the quarters of the land, and he divided the land by lot. He divided the land. Daniel 11:39. He shall divide the land for gain. So the Antichrist would also divide the land of Israel. This is very, very clear from the prophecy. Antiochus does the same exact thing. And again, this is what we're seeing in our day. Then Daniel 11, verse 33 says, many will fall and be tried. Okay, so let's take a look. I'm going to read it to you. But the people that know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Okay, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many. They shall fall by the sword. Okay, so it says many will fall by the sword. They will be martyred.
They'll fall by the sword, by flame and captivity and spoil many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be hoping for a little help, and many of them shall cleave to them by flatteries. And some of them of understanding shall fall, and to try them, and to purge them, and to make them white even to the times of the end, because the end is for an appointed time. So what I just read to you is verses that have more to do with the end of days, but it did happen in Hanukah as well. In 2 Maccabees chapter 7, it talks about the 7 brothers and their mother being martyred because they refused to change the custom and the law. They refused to eat the swine that was sacrificed, okay? They identified what was happening was the Antichrist, and they believed in the resurrection. It's a God will resurrect us, okay? So that has a partial fulfillment here, but in the end of days, this is why, we have martyrdom taking place, because it will purge us, okay? And again, the head wound, and he shall come to an end, and none shall help him. That's verse 45. Well, in Daniel chapter 8, verse 25, he said, he'll be broken without hand. Okay, well, this is what we see. In 2 Maccabees 9, it talks about this head wound or head plague. And the Lord God Almighty, God of Israel, smote him with an incurable and invisible disease, invisible plague. And as soon as he spoke, the pain of his bowels that was remediless came upon him, and sore torments of his inner parts. For he tormented others' bowels, and with many strange torments. Okay? So that's clearly what is the fulfillment of the head plague of Revelation 13, verses 2 and 3.
Now, there's many more parallels and things we can learn, guys. And what I've done is just narrow it down to some things that are less obvious. Things that do stand out to us when we do look at them. Things that you may never have considered. I bet you didn't consider the Antichrist was a partier, or an actor, or that the head wound was, in fact, a plague. So, guys, this is a series that we're doing on Hanukah. And here we have the profile of the Antichrist. It would be really good if you followed along in the series, okay? And you got the notes. So we'll make the notes available to you. We have covered before in previous videos. We've covered the story of Hanukah. It tells us about the wedding supper. It tells us about prophecy of the abomination that makes desolate, and Christ's message about the house, the field, the wife. What do these things mean? Okay. And we saw the clear parallels between Matthew 24 and Revelation, with the exception of these verses that tell us about Hanukah. So we talked about that in previous videos. Please watch them. Please refer to the previous videos on what we're talking about there with the Sabbath day and Hanukah. Okay. Of course, the apostate Christians thinks this is all Jewish. Well, this is the Old Testament time period. You just get rid of the whole Bible because they were Jews? No, it's the Bible. Okay? So this is a time period that is very significant of what Christ is talking about when he's talking about when you see the abomination makes desolate, fleeing Judea, the housetop, the fields, woe to them were a child. How do we understand those things? It's in Hanukah. So guys, thanks for watching. We'll put this together as a series of videos on Hanukah, which is really good to follow along with all of them, okay? The actual days of the feast are coming up. Today is the 22nd day of the 9th month. So Hanukkah Eve is the 24th, and then the 25th is the 8 days, okay? So in future videos, we're going to see how Hanukkah tells us about the wedding supper and Armageddon, okay? But in this one, we have the profiles of the Antichrist. So thanks for watching, and God bless you.